Welcome to the debate. Jesus begins in a manger and ends before an empty tomb. But the journey between those 2 points is, well, it's often misremembered as just a random collection of moral teachings and isolated miracles. Today, we are arguing that this is entirely wrong.
Right.
How do the Gospels construct the life of Jesus as one coherent journey? I argue that the text presents this highly intentional geographical and narrative trajectory. Every single step, from the hidden years in the Galilee region to the final confrontation in Jerusalem, it all builds inevitable tension toward a deliberate sacrifice. Like, this wasn't an accident of history. It was a perfectly executed mission.
And I look at the exact same text, and I see a deeply subversive narrative that relies heavily on paradox, not just a straightforward orchestrated march. Why does this story begin in absolute obscurity? Why does it escalate into a massive public conflict that ends in total disaster for his followers? And why does it culminate in an ending that forces you to completely redefine the path that got you there? To understand this narrative, we really have to separate the brutal historical grit of first-century Roman occupation from the profound theological interpretation that the text demands.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is a story of power and humility and victory and defeat, which constantly subverts what anyone, even his own disciples, expected a Messiah to be.
The paradox you are highlighting is real, but I think it is highly calculated. Let's look at the starting point, around 5 BC. For a modern listener, a census just sounds like a boring, bureaucratic event, right?
Right, just filling out forms.
Exactly. But in the first century, it was a brutal instrument of imperial dominance and taxation. Mary and Joseph make a dangerous 90-mile journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem precisely because of this mandatory census ordered by Caesar Augustus. The backdrop is an Israel crushed under Rome's iron fist.
And compounded by the paranoia of Herod the Great.
Right, exactly. So they end up in a dark cave used to shelter animals. And the first witnesses to this birth are shepherds.
And that is exactly the paradox I am talking about. We really cannot gloss over the shepherds. In that sociological context, shepherds were considered ceremonially unclean outcasts.
Yeah, they were entirely on the fringes.
Exactly. They couldn't enter the temple, and their testimony wasn't even valid in a court of law. If the text is claiming the birth of the King of Kings, why start an absolute vulnerability with the lowest class of society? It is a stark contrast to the reality of power at the time. You mentioned Herod the Great.
Yeah, a deeply unstable figure.
Very. This is a paranoid monarch suffering from gangrene who had drowned his favorite wife and executed 3 of his own sons just to protect his throne. So when Persian astronomer priests, the Magi, arrive asking about a newborn king, Herod's reaction is sheer terror. He orders the massacre of all children under 2 in the Bethlehem area.
Which underscores the historical staging perfectly, but it also highlights the theological orchestration. That sheer terror forces the family into exile in Egypt, funded precisely by the gold the Magi brought.
Which is fascinating on its own.
Fulfill ancient prophecies, mapping Jesus onto the history of Israel itself. But notice how the geography functions when they finally return. They avoid Judea because Herod's cruel son is ruling, and they are steered north to Nazareth.
Right, a village of barely 300 people that doesn't even appear in the Old Testament. It is a place of total obscurity. Again, the paradox of a hidden king. I struggle to see the master plan in hiding in a remote backwater for 30 years.
Well, I have to stop you there, because the idea that Nazareth was an isolated backwater is a modern misconception.
Wait, really? How so?
Yeah, he was hidden, yes, but he was hidden in plain sight. Nazareth was just 6 kilometers from the Via Maris, which was the major international highway connecting the empires of Egypt and Damascus. Think of it like living just off a major interstate highway.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Furthermore, from the hills above Nazareth, a young Jesus was only an hour's walk from Sepphoris, a bustling cosmopolitan capital that Herod Antipas was actively rebuilding. So he didn't grow up in a remote cabin. He grew up watching the political and economic world pass by, preparing for a mission.
Okay, even if we grant that geographical proximity, the text goes practically silent for 30 years. When he finally breaks that silence, he goes to the Jordan River to be baptized by John. And geographically, this is fascinating.
It's incredibly symbolic.
Or is what happens next. If you want to start a religious revolution, you go to the religious capital, right? You go to Jerusalem.
That would be the expected move, yeah.
Instead, he launches his public ministry in Capernaum, a corrupt border town heavily populated by Gentiles, featuring a Roman customs station. From a historical perspective, launching a movement in a marginalized trade route seems almost suicidal, not strategic.
Well, I completely disagree with that framing. Choosing Capernaum on the Via Maris was the ancient equivalent of launching a viral campaign on a major internet backbone rather than a closed corporate intranet.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, because every merchant, soldier, and traveler passing through that region heard about him, and the miracles he performed there were deeply calculated to trigger a specific response. We often treat the miracles as just a laundry list of good deeds, but they were theological alarm bells. Take the healing of the leper.
You mean when he touched a man whose disease made him a social and religious pariah?
Exactly, that one. Leprosy was viewed as a divine curse, a living death sentence. Touching a leper made you ceremonially unclean. But when Jesus restores the man's skin, it is not just an act of medical compassion.
Right, there's a deeper layer.
Yes. In the first century religious framework, there was an ancient belief that only the Messiah could heal a leper. So by healing him, Jesus was forcing the religious elite in Jerusalem into a corner. It was a massive declaration of identity that forced his presence into the public eye and triggered the massive crowds.
But the crowds fundamentally misunderstood him, and I think this is where the narrative tension really tightens. Yes, the miracles escalate, but what is the crowd's reaction when he feeds 5,000 people from a few loaves of bread?
They want to make him king.
Exactly. They want to make him a political king by force. The first century expectation of a Messiah was a military warlord who would march on Jerusalem and slaughter the Romans. That was the political pressure cooker he was operating in.
And he constantly rejects that projection. He flat out refuses to be their political warlord. Instead, he offers teachings that completely invert societal values. Like in the Sermon on the Mount, he takes everything the Roman and religious systems admire: strength, wealth, power, dominance.
And he flips it.
He turns it upside down. He blesses the poor, the meek, the mourners. He tells his followers to love their enemies. He is actively redefining the kingdom.
But let's be honest about the mechanics of that redefinition. It alienates his own followers. When he tells the crowds in Capernaum, "I am the bread of life. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life," he isn't building a tidy coalition.
No, not at all.
Many of his followers are deeply scandalized by this bizarre language, and they abandon him. If this is an orchestrated mission to build a movement, he frequently sabotages his own popularity. He heals a paralyzed man at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, but he chooses to do it on the Sabbath, directly violating religious law.
Yep.
And then he compares himself to God. To the Pharisees, this isn't just provocative, it is intolerable blasphemy.
But it is intentional provocation. The miracles and the teachings purposely agitate the elite because the narrative arc is driving inevitably toward Jerusalem. The timeline is undeniable here. Just look at the absolute point of no return historically and narratively, the raising of Lazarus.
Okay, let's look at Lazarus. Jesus waits 2 full days after hearing his friend is sick. By the time he arrives in Bethany, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days.
And that 4 days detail is absolutely critical. The rabbinic belief of the time was that the soul hovered near the body for 3 days, hoping to re-enter. By the 4th day, decay set in, and death was absolute.
There was no coming back.
Exactly. When Jesus shouts, "Lazarus, come out," and a dead man walks out of the grave, it completely shatters the natural order. It becomes the most public, undeniable miracle of his life.
And it acts as the match that finally lights the powder keg. But we need to explain why it triggered such a severe reaction. The Sanhedrin, which is essentially the Jewish Supreme Court and the primary political liaison to Rome, they call an emergency meeting. Caiaphas, the high priest, does a cold political calculus.
Israel at this time is like a room filled with gas just waiting for a spark.
Very volatile. Incredibly volatile. The Romans were terrified of popular uprisings. Caiaphas argues that if this miracle worker gathers a massive following, Rome will view it as a rebellion and send legions to crush the Jewish nation
and destroy the temple. The underlying motive may be envy, but the explicit justification is national security. The unanimous vote is cast. Jesus must die to save the nation.
Which makes the events of the final week a masterpiece of orchestrated confrontation. Because Jesus knows this decree is out, yet he orchestrates the triumphal entry anyway. He rides down the Mount of Olives on a donkey.
A huge public display.
Exactly.
For a modern audience, that might just seem quaint, but it is a direct callback to a 500-year-old prophecy by Zechariah. It signaled a king coming in peace, not a warlord coming to conquer. The crowd, swollen with Passover pilgrims who had heard about Lazarus, waves palm branches. And then he goes to the temple.
The very next day, he enters the temple, specifically the court of the Gentiles, and braids a whip to drive out the money changers. He completely cripples the corrupt financial engine of the religious elite.
And because he just publicly dismantled the temple's economic engine, staying in the city became instantly fatal. This forces them to retreat to the cover of an olive grove called Gethsemane. At night, the religious leaders are desperate but terrified of sparking a riot during Passover. They need an inside man, and they get Judas Iscariot to hand him over for 30 pieces of silver.
And here in Gethsemane, the narrative bridges profound theological weight with brutal medical reality. The text describes his sweat becoming like great drops of blood.
Hematodosis.
Yes, exactly. It's a rare but documented medical condition where crushing psychological stress ruptures the skin's capillaries, mixing blood with sweat. He is in absolute agony, anticipating the cross, yet his prayer is one of complete, calculated surrender. Not my will, but yours be done.
I struggle with this idea of a calculated mission when the text refuses to sanitize the sheer panic and catastrophe of the people involved. I mean, when Judas arrives with the temple guards under the cover of darkness, what happens? The very disciples who swore to die for him abandon him and flee into the night.
They scatter.
Completely. Peter, the supposed rock of the group, cowers in a courtyard and denies even knowing Jesus 3 times to a servant girl. The failure of his followers is total and complete.
Well, the failure of the disciples highlights the isolation required for the sacrifice. Every step from his arrest is mechanically designed to fulfill the narrative arc. Let's trace the illegality of the night trials. Why at night? Because Jesus was too popular. If they arrested him in daylight, there's a riot.
Right, they had to do it quietly.
Exactly. Jewish law strictly forbade trials at night, trials during the Passover festival, and executing a sentence on the same day as the verdict. Yet, he is shuttled in secret to Caiaphas. During this illegal trial, Jesus quotes the prophecy of Daniel 7, a famous apocalyptic text about a divine Son of Man who rules the cosmos.
A huge claim.
He is explicitly claiming divine authority. The verdict is instantly blasphemy. But because Judea is under Roman rule, the Sanhedrin doesn't have the legal authority to execute him. They need the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate.
And Pilate's interrogation reveals the absurdity of the political charges. He asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replies, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate looks at this beaten man and sees absolutely no political threat to the Roman Empire.
He didn't see him as an insurrectionist.
No. He repeatedly tries to release him. He even offers a Passover amnesty choice to the crowd. Jesus, or a known insurrectionist and murderer named Barabbas.
And the crowd chooses Barabbas.
Yes, the crowd, the exact same demographic that shouted Hosanna days earlier, chooses the murderer. Why? Because they were disillusioned. They wanted a liberator to kill Romans, not a bloodied philosopher.
Pilate orders the scourging, using a whip laced with bone and metal designed to flay the skin, bringing the victim to the brink of death. Weakened, Jesus carries the crossbeam down the Via Dolorosa. But we must understand the severe physiological reality of crucifixion. You might assume the crucifixion was just about bleeding, but death came primarily through asphyxiation.
It's an agonizing way to die.
Truly. To draw a single breath, the victim had to push their entire body upward using their nailed feet as a lever, scraping their flayed back against the rough wood. This agonizing, suffocating struggle lasted for hours.
It was a public billboard of terror, engineered by Rome to inflict maximum pain for the longest possible time, serving as a warning to anyone who defied the empire. And yet, the narrative injects immense supernatural weight into this grim historical reality. From noon to 3, darkness covers the land. Finally, Jesus breathes his last words. It is finished.
It is finished. That phrase is the crux of the theological claim embedded in the entire narrative. Jesus' life wasn't taken from him by the Romans or the Sanhedrin. He surrendered it to complete a transaction. At that exact moment, the text notes that the massive, heavy veil in the Jerusalem temple is torn in two from top to bottom.
Tearing the veil.
Yes, and to understand that, you have to realize the veil was the physical barrier keeping the holiness of God separate from the impurity of humanity. Tearing it from top to bottom symbolizes that God himself initiated the destruction of that barrier.
Well, let's look at it from the ground level in that moment. For the disciples, it just looks like the end of the world. Judas is crushed by unbearable guilt, throws the blood money back at the priests, and hangs himself. The rest of the disciples are hiding behind locked doors, terrified they are next on Rome's execution list.
It was a terrifying moment.
Extremely. The religious leaders have Roman guards stationed at a tomb sealed with a 2-ton stone. So if the story ends here, it's just another tragic account of a failed messianic claimant, crushed by the gears of the Roman war machine. So what changes when the story ends with a resurrection?
Well, everything changes, because the empty tomb fundamentally redefines every single step that came before it. On Sunday morning, the stone is rolled away, and notice who the narrative chooses as the very first witness, Mary Magdalene.
Right, a woman.
Yes. In that patriarchal culture, a woman's testimony was considered illegally invalid. If you were inventing a myth to convince the ancient world, you would never use women as your primary witnesses. Yet the text uses the very voices the world marginalized to announce the most critical event in history.
That is a profound subversion of expectations. And the subsequent post-resurrection appearances are shockingly intimate. I mean, if you were constructing a triumphant theological victory lap, you would expect a resurrected deity to march right into Pilate's bedroom or appear before Caiaphas in blinding light for spectacular revenge.
That would be the expected Hollywood ending. Yeah.
Exactly. Instead, he appears to 2 despondent disciples walking a dusty road to Emmaus, explaining the scriptures to them. He suddenly appears in the locked upper room, offering peace, not reprimand, to his terrified friends.
And he meets their doubts head-on. Thomas wasn't there that first night and demands empirical proof. A week later, Jesus appears specifically for Thomas, inviting him to touch the physical wounds. It is an embodied, physical resurrection, not a ghost story.
And the intimacy extends to Peter. They go back to Galilee, back to fishing, retreating to exactly what they knew before this whole journey started. Jesus calls to them from the shore. Over a fire with broiled fish, Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?"
It perfectly mirrors his denials.
Yes, it completely undoes Peter's 3 frantic denials in the courtyard. It is a quiet, localized restoration. It's not flashy. It is deeply personal.
Yet, from that quiet beach, it scales up rapidly. He gathers them on a mountain, and the text states he appeared to 500 of his followers at once. 500 witnesses, who would eventually face immense persecution, maintaining until their brutal deaths that they saw a resurrected man. Finally, he ascends, leaving them with a promise of the Holy Spirit, a promise fulfilled weeks later when a movement is launched that eventually sweeps the entire Roman Empire.
When you lay out the map from the Bethlehem Cave to the Mount of Olives, you really do see a distinct shape. The historical staging, the Herodian paranoia, the brutal Roman occupation, the sociological tensions regarding shepherds, lepers, and women, it all provides a hyper-realistic foundation.
Yeah, it grounds the story in reality.
But the text weaves that gritty history with immense theological claims. A deity entering the world in absolute poverty, utilizing miracles as calculated messianic declarations, intentionally provoking a fatal political confrontation, and vindicating those claims through a bodily resurrection.
Exactly. I like to think of the entire narrative's mechanics using a specific analogy. The life of Jesus in the Gospels is like a road that begins quietly in the dark, gathers massive, noisy crowds in the daylight, enters a brutal, seemingly impassable canyon of conflict, but its true destination is only understood when you look back from the summit of the empty tomb. The end redefines the meaning of every single step that came before it.
It certainly requires the reader to grapple with both the historical grit and the theological altitude. You cannot easily disentangle the carpenter from Nazareth navigating Galilean politics from the figure who claims divine authority over life and death. The tension is baked into the text from the manger to the cross.
And that tension is what makes the narrative so enduring. The geography, the miracles, and the escalating conflict construct a single, unbreakable narrative arc.
We do have to acknowledge, though, that where the historical documentation ends and the theological interpretation begins remains a space where scholars, skeptics, and believers will always wrestle. The Gospels demand a verdict from the reader, but they don't force an easy conclusion.
Which leaves us with a profound educational takeaway. The life of Jesus matters not only because of its famous isolated moments, ethical teachings, or historical controversies. It matters because the entire journey, from the absolute vulnerability in a Bethlehem cave to the unexplainable reality of an empty tomb, forms one coherent story whose ultimate meaning can only be fully grasped in its entirety. And just as the disciples had to walk that road to understand it, the text invites you to look closely at the map, from the manger to the empty tomb, and weigh the evidence for yourself.